Time gates. It's the latest craze or trigger among critics of the World of Warcraft Legion. The sort of pacing isn't new, it's been around since some of the earliest days of WoW, but somehow, maybe with thanks to echo chambers within various corners of the internet, it's become this sudden phenomenon. Somehow now it's unacceptable that the narrative of WoW's story is staged in episodic pieces. Somehow now players find it better to have content front-loaded and forced down their throats. Somehow the lessons Blizzard has learned over 12 years of producing the World of Warcraft, the data and surveys and trials and errors and successes and failures, don't matter. 7.2 has been out, and for many vocal players, this, quote, largest patch ever is nothing more than another boast and a future meme. But I have a different perspective and an opinion to offer. Hey, it's Saul, bringing to you the World of Warcraft. Today I'm going to go over this most recent content deployment, basically Blizzard's approach to how they give us things to do and how we're told to digest it. As always, let's not pretend that I'm on a pedestal. I'm not a designer, I'm just a fan. I've been playing long enough to know that 7.2 is a very, very different patch from previous ones. The talk about time gating and whatever might have legs, but is a bit short-sighted. On the other hand, Blizzard has done a poor job of communicating just what this patch means to them and to players. In other words, in my opinion, Blizzard has delivered on their promise to bring players a constant flow of activities and content. But they screwed up on managing players' expectations with poor messaging, leading to the false perceptions of waiting and time gating. My hopes are that I can give my perspective and help you understand what's going on. And I could be wrong. Oh well. The days and weeks before the launch of 7.2 was like any other pre-launch. Anxious players were preparing themselves for the upcoming storm. Content creators and writers were busily working at producing guides and tips and walkthroughs to help these players along. Economists guesstimated the incoming disruption of in-game and WoW token markets. When the guns fired off on US realms and the patch was deployed earlier than anticipated, the floodgates opened and like dogs being let out of a cage, WoW's most fervent players were let loose upon the broken shore. But when the dust settled and our foothold was established, we asked, what's next? When are the assaults coming? When can I upgrade my order hall talents? Where's the content? What came afterward was an amalgam of some wonder, confusion, frustration, anger, anxiety, and other emotions that summed up to a sobering conclusion. Blizzard must have gone wrong with this patch. Over the next week or so, while taking care of the numerous patch bugs that are of the usual fare, Blizzard finally, but again poorly, clarified just how this patch launch was supposed to go. Some of which, by the way, wasn't even new information, just information that many players forgot within the maelstrom of other news, updates, notes, tweets, posts, and live Q&As. As it turns out, Blizzard's plan to slowly release 7.2 content over time was both an understatement and an entirely intentional endeavor on their part. The Order Hall campaign wasn't just an 11-week-long questline, but an engine of content deployment that helped create a natural feeling of advancement within the Legion story. Of course, on top of that was a new dungeon, the additions of Heroic and Mythic and Keystone and Hell pet dungeons, increased difficulty throughout most content types, a bunch of new world quests, and progression for our weapons and quality of life changes, but that didn't seem to matter to a lot of people. Vocal players wanted something new to do right now, and doing more of the same, even with a refresh, wasn't cutting it. This was 7.2. This isn't a small patch like 7.15, and 7.1 was done and over with many, many moons ago. This was the big patch. The patch. But it hasn't delivered, at least not yet. But again, that didn't seem to matter. That hasn't stemmed the anger and frustration of waiting for these arbitrary time gates, as they call them. This is catering to casuals, some say. This is a disrespect to players who want to play their game in the manner and pace of their choosing. To a more harsh critic, 7.2 is a disaster compared to most other major patches. Players are accustomed to a veritable jackhammer of content invading your personal space for days or weeks at a time, getting players into this high of game consumption and content binging until Valor points and rep and timeless coins are spilling out of your ears. 7.2, by contrast, is what they call a series of gates. So just what was Blizzard thinking with this sort of deployment approach? We've got to go back to BlizzCon 2016 and focus on a key phrase that isn't class fantasy. Instead, it's the, quote, steady stream of content that Ian Hazzikostas and his team are pushing in Legion. And it's shown in ways that haven't been so heavily practiced in past expansions. And it's subtle. Take the Nighthold raid, for example. Early on, the public was under the impression that it'd be part of a multi-raid initial tier for Legion. And it was, though it turned out that the Nighthold would be released nearly half a year later. even though the data from the raid was already prepared for deployment, sitting in players' hard drives for months, waiting to be used until the time was right. Instead of the Nighthold raid, we were surprised with the inclusion of the Karazhan dungeon and the Trial of Valor raid. Think what you will of how they turned out, but the point is that Legion wasn't simply front-loaded with the initial raid tier. This tier took a while, and as of this recording, we're still on this first tier, if we can still even call it that. Let's look at the new content platforms that came with Legion. World Quest and Keystone Dungeons are two examples of what I've called content platforms that can be modified and upgraded over time to keep them relevant indefinitely, and they have. Then throw in scalable rewards, level scaling, and this fangled item level scaling, and you have a nearly complete package of activities and systems to support continued updates to gameplay, even if absolutely no new activities are introduced. In other words, Blizzard can use these platforms to feel less pressured to make brand new content because current content is still useful. Feel free to disagree with that approach out of the principle that game designers should always seek to create new and fun things. But it's my strong opinion that regardless, content platforms are smart ways to keep players engaged. I agree that Blizzard ought to continue to innovate and create and not just reiterate, but it's also impossible and exhausting to put Blizzard in a prison of just developing one new thing after another without evolving from what may have been good ideas. Making a new battleground, for example, by combining elements of old battlegrounds and smashing them together isn't automatically a brilliant idea. Taking a classic battleground and dressing it up with subtle effects to freshen the look and feel isn't either, but it's certainly less risky and has opportunities to grow, or to give up and move on to other things with fewer losses. Blizzard has been laying down the elements of Legion like building a train track, one rail in front of the other, keeping a pace that's doing its best to avoid long gaps of having nothing to do. Today's players are both empowered and imprisoned to enjoy or burden themselves with Legion's many activities that are objectively relevant but subjectively entertaining. How long was it until Warlords of Draenor dungeons lost relevance until Mythic Dungeons came along? At what point did you stop doing dailies in Cataclysm? Which brings us back to 7.2 and Blizzard's failure to communicate what 7.2 was really meant to be. It was sold to players as a huge patch, and it might be. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot to experience both today and in the coming months with the campaign and the raid and God knows what else is in the data. But it should not have been hyped the way that it was. It shouldn't have had a trailer released, at least not yet. Maybe, to help players understand better, it shouldn't have been called 7.2, maybe it should have been called 7.1.9, because this patch is what it is, a game update, a data dump. Major patch revisions have been associated with the centerpiece of the ongoing story. 7.2 brings us the Tomb of Sargeras, but just not today or tomorrow, more like a couple of months. Right now, on top of what we have is a revision of existing activities and content and features that I'd argue is welcome, but not very exciting. It's just a patch. Blizzard should have slowly and meaningfully clarified what 7.2 was going to be while carefully explaining the very meaning of what a, quote, steady flow of content means to the players. That too means very different things if you look at the complaints on the forums and the posts and the YouTubes. Blizzard was not kidding about this phrase. It started with the initial delivery of Legion content to the month leading to the Emerald Nightmare, to the attunements to Karazhan and the Trial of Valor, to the multi-week campaign leading up to the Nighthold, and finally finishing that Balance of Power questline by the way, to the now multi-week campaign leading up to the Tomb of Sargeras, and all the filler content in between that, I should add, has been revisited and refined over time. Up until Legion, content delivery has been mostly about replacing the old with the new, and offering ways to transition players through catch-up mechanisms we're already familiar with. Legion's content delivery is mostly about stacking these many activities with each patch, and making sure that as players move between one activity and another, everything is updated to ensure that nothing is too trivial, even for powerful players. This continued relevance means that releases of newer content like, say, a whole zone, have to be weighed carefully with everything that already exists. The older paradigm of funneling players away from the old content and towards the Molten Front, or the Timeless Isle, or Tanan Jungle doesn't apply here to the Broken Shore. This isn't that kind of patch. This isn't that kind of expansion. It's why players are split about their enjoyment of the delivery of 7.2 so far. One side of players says there's nothing to do but wait, while the other side points out that the grind has no end. Somewhere in between is the rest of us. 7.2 hasn't quite missed the mark on its overall delivery. We can't say that with certainty until the final boss of the Tomb of Sargeras is defeated. But Blizzard missed the mark entirely with the messaging. If Blizzard wants to continue with this style of content delivery, they've got to understand, and more importantly, help their players understand, that WoW content is no longer centered around the patch that's released under, but the merits of the content itself. One day, if and when Blizzard gets this right, a patch like 7.2 will deploy with little fanfare, aside from the immediate systems and class changes, almost like how system pre-patches are launched before an expansion's launch. From there, the trailers and the hype will come from actual release dates of raid and story content. The Tomb of Sargeras trailer is released several weeks before the raid actually launches, not the patch that it sits on. That would be a methodology that better controls player expectations while preserving what is, at least in my opinion, a smart delivery system that keeps players engaged. This is definitely a lesson for Blizzard to learn. If they do, players will both understand and accept this approach without even realizing it, and then they can focus on how much Nomi still sucks. Share your thoughts, and stay breezy.